Get you in a blazer.
You look nice.
Yeah, thanks.
But I gave a talk today to about 30 leaders from around the area, and I'm exhausted. These people were wonderful. You could tell they're so deeply committed to children and their communities. And I'm exhausted. They do this all day, every day. Oh, man.
That is so funny.
Yeah, that's normal. That all sounds normal. I know. It sounds like your typical day of working with folks. I just was like,
100%.
You know what I was also reminded of? Because I know you have a young child, and my brother asked me to help him out with some childcare stuff. And so I went to pick up my niece at school. I was supposed to take her to gymnastics. Then she wasn't at the school because she got on the bus by mistake. And I had to go to the bus stop and go find her at the bus stop and get her over to gymnastics. But as we're driving there, she's got to pee. And then I pull over to go to the McDonald's. But then she's like, I don't have to pee. And so then we're back in the car. We're driving over to the gymnastics. I'm telling you, man, whoa, that's normal life. That happened today. It happened today where Dee Dee was supposed to pick up Leo on the way back from town. Her job requires now that she shifted her job a little bit, and she's in charge of every major event at both children's hospitals, at San Francisco and at Oakland. And so she has this huge event. She's in Oakland today dealing with that event, but she's like, no problem. I'll just get out early. I'll grab him. And she calls and she says, I'm not going to make it. And I'm like, oh, okay. All right. I'm getting in the car. And just like that, I'm in the car driving to his school to pick him up. He knows no different. It's all fine, but it's scramble this, do that, go there, figure it out, get back. Exactly. And then come face as I get in. Hey, buddy, how you doing? How's it going? Hey, did you have a good day? What happened today? What was the best part? You know, like I'm asking some questions. I'm like, because it's my niece, not my kid. I'm like, hey, knucklehead, why'd you get on the bus? My God. She's like, I realized when the bus had left the school that I was supposed to stay at the school. I'm like, yeah, no problem. The school's like, yeah, I guess supposed to have her wait. Sorry about that. You know where the bus stop is? I'm like, no. Just like some creepy dude driving from bus stop to bus stop.
Yeah, but it makes you either.
It's okay, you got a white van, right? That doesn't matter.
Yeah, a movie of you're part of the Scooby-Doo crew, or
exactly. And I wouldn't have got away with it too if it weren't for you meddling kids. They were always meddling,
and they were always investigating sort of land barons. These guys that were trying to like steal the land.
Yes, exactly. With wildly creative costumes. Like these guys, the parents had quite the costume.
And it was the primary baron. It was the primary land baron. It was
with like a reservoir of bioluminescence. They were always glowing.
Oh my goodness gracious.
So listen, we talked to this really interesting guy who I just was absolutely smitten with. I just really enjoyed his approach to schools, his real desire to celebrate schools, celebrate teachers, to find ways to elevate in such a time where reclaiming the narrative around schools is so important. And so, what were some of your thoughts?
I actually thought I would start with something he said at the end. What are the 3 things or reasons that people reach out to you for?
Don't you want to ask everybody that?
It's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's what a great thing.
There's so much brilliance in this conversation. Let's do this. Why don't we listen to the conversation and then we'll come back. For your listeners out there, if you wouldn't mind taking a moment as you're beginning to listen, think about the 3 reasons why people might call you. Like, why do people contact you? It'll make sense as you listen to this conversation. You're listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. Imperfect leaders. Are you facing challenges filling open speech-language pathologist positions within your district? Kind of a silly question, because I know you are. MPAT Speech understands the critical need for qualified professionals in your schools. They recognize that communication lies at the heart of academic success, and that's why they're dedicated to helping you bridge the gap by offering expert therapists and innovative telehealth solutions. Don't let open positions hinder your students' success. Partner with MPAT Speech today and ensure every child in your district has access to the speech therapy they deserve. MPAT Speech, EMPAT Speech.com. Empowering students, empowering schools. Today on An Imperfect Leader, my guest is Vikas Pota, the founder of T4 Education, a digital platform he established as a response to the educational challenges posed by the pandemic. Prior to T4, Vikas set up and ran a philanthropic foundation focused on teachers. He launched and ran the Global Teacher Prize as a way of shining a spotlight on the greatness of the profession. And he made the case at UN platforms, at G20, and to several governments about the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs as they're known around the world. He established a technical and vocational skills business on the continent of Africa to tackle the youth unemployment crisis, and he set up a corporate venture capital business investing in high-growth edtech business. Vikas, welcome to An Imperfect Leader.
Thank you so much for your kind invitation. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
You and I were connected by a mutual friend, our friend Mia, in the edtech community, and there are so many directions to go in our conversation today. I loved learning about your work with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Actually, in our house, our son, who's very involved with Model UN, he has them posted in his room. I love that you found a way to spotlight teachers and put that in terms for school superintendents around the country. I often say that one of our jobs is to serve as that town crier, essentially announcing to the world that there are amazing things happening in schools and classrooms across the globe. And so now, as I understand it, you've expanded to give a prize to the world's best schools through your firm T4. So maybe we could start there. Would you tell us about T4 and the World's Best Schools Prize?
Sure. Well, the thing that I realized at the beginning of the pandemic was after having a very long and established career in philanthropy and grant making towards education, and with a specific lens and focus on teachers, what really hit me during COVID as I turned on my social media channels and saw my friends who were teachers struggling and actually doing, a heroic job actually in making sure the continuity of learning during that time, I came to realize that actually for a teacher to actually succeed, there's a humongous ecosystem that needs to also come into play. And whilst I'm a huge fan of teachers and I have campaigned long and hard about the importance of teacher status in particular as a way of dealing with the teacher recruitment and retention crisis in the world, we need to make more teachers feel loved. We need to make sure that society understands their importance. And that, I think, is a more thought out way of actually attracting the best and brightest into the profession, who today, sadly, I say, consider other professions first and then teaching. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, Peter, I started thinking about all the challenges I was seeing. And the biggest thing I learned was actually that maybe I'm late to the game. It was this overwhelming importance of institutions. And in our sector, that means schools and universities. How do we strengthen these institutions that exist in our societies today? There's some research done about 10 years ago. We took all the official statistics from governments around the world who often categorize schools in different ways. And there's an inspections regime, for example, in the UK called Ofsted. And until recently, they used to categorize schools as outstanding, good, bad, and failing. And so if you aggregated the number of kids in failing schools around the world, do you know what that number came to 10 years ago?
No, I don't, but I'm hoping you're going to give me the answer.
We estimated about 500 million children are in officially failing schools. Now you tell me, how does your mind even compute? What does your conscience say?
First, I would tell you I become oppositional because having been a teacher and a principal in the U.S., a Title I school, which has a high percentage of children who receive free or reduced lunch, often some of the teachers there were the very best in the entire district. They knew their craft and were working incredibly hard. The circumstances of children coming to school underprepared is not any blame of the teacher or their families. It's a blame of the system that didn't take care of them. Okay, but you're going to say 500 million children considered to be in failing schools. Wow.
And so the question was, when I reflect upon my own journey, and I'm an extensive traveler throughout my whole career, wherever I went, I'd always go to a great school. I'd always meet a great teacher. Then the question really arises, if there's great schools everywhere, why aren't there more? And it's not as if the research doesn't exist. It's not as if the evidence doesn't exist about what makes a great school. And so how do we get more of these? And that's where I came across this idea of actually thinking about showcasing best practices, creating peer-to-peer networks, which really are the game changer when it comes to education. And actually, when you shine a spotlight on something that's great, you also inspire. And I think we need a lot more of that in our education systems around the world.
It's so interesting that you approach this it seems very logical. You approach this from an appreciative inquiry lens. What's going well and how do we get more of it, as opposed to bashing down the episodic examples of underperformance and then indicting the entire system because of that.
Yeah, the biggest learning that I've had in this process is, now that we've had 3 cycles of the World's Best School Prizes, I get asked this question, increasingly, is there a commonality between these schools? They come from all different quarters, all different contexts. If it was that simple, we could fix the world. But actually, there's a lot more detail that goes into it, a lot more thought that goes into it. And when I applied myself to these 50 schools every year that we shortlist, the thing I learned was, yes, leadership is so important in these contexts, but leadership may be 90% of the story, but there is another 10%. There is something else there. And it's what you and I would refer to as organizational culture. The schools that seem to do well have an incredible leadership team that understands how to embed culture, think about that comprehensively and quite deeply as a means of driving higher performance. That's what we have learned. In response to that, we've created something called Best School to Work, which is an assessment tool for schools to use to assess where they stand with regards to their culture of their school. And I think that's a really powerful thing to do.
You're really speaking to, I think it's Margaret Wheatley's work around the cultural field of an organization the moment you walk into a school. Is there student workup? When you look down the hall, is there a child helping a child? Is there a teacher working with a child in a very human-centered, very empathetic way? When you walk into the main office, do they immediately just say to you, sign in? Which is sometimes you walk in, you go, whoa, that's how you greet people, as opposed to, we are so glad you're here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I take that on board. And that became so obvious to me, Peter, through the World's Best School Prizes. And that is what I now talk about a lot, which is we need higher performance in schools. There is no one size fits all, but let's try doing it. Let's just understand and assess where we stand today as a way of thinking about how we can improve the situation or how we can become better. And it's a tool to ensure that we get better schools and stronger institutions is how we talk about it. So that's what the journey has brought me to. And the prizes are quite a wondrous thing. And I often think in terms of people get snooty about prizes. Oh, it's a prize. But let me give you some data points which are quite interesting. The first thing is everyone loves prizes. Let's be clear. You can pretend not to like prizes. But I bet you've tuned into the Oscars. I bet you watch the Grammys. I bet you every school has a prize of some kind, which is a platform to celebrating success. And so when people say to me, prize is such a cheap thing, I'm saying, well, not really. We use it in so many different parts of our lives. We're so exposed to it. What's really interesting about prizes is that, of course, the school shines and everything, but it allows other people to take credit for that school as well. The community comes around it. The politicians come around it. And what we've had as a result of our prizes in the last 3 years are pretty significant systemic impacts. So, for example, in the Philippines, we had a school that rebuilt an entire mangroves ecosystem over 10 years. And it had been doing so silently and diligently and to great success. A typhoon had demolished that harbor, as it were. And the school really applied itself. Because of the prizes and the media coverage, the Secretary of Education for that region gave 1.2 million learners a climate action project. Or I can tell you about Chile, where the school that won our innovation prize in our first year, within 5 hours of announcing that prize, the president of the country was in that school, proclaiming that innovation as part of his reform program. Or last year, we had a school in Colombia that won our environmental action prize, and the Minister of Education announced 2 new laws about climate education. These schools have existed in the ecosystem for a very long time, but it took a prize to bounce people to take action. And that's how I think about the contribution of these kinds of mechanisms, and there are mechanisms to push the conversation forward.
So prize as recognition of an entire school system, not one individual, but rather the whole system. So if we're looking at it from systems thinking, it is the school community and the community at large that is supporting and providing. And then it's really becomes allowing those who are in a position of power to bless the good work and to endorse that others should try these things as well. I work with an organization called Be the Change Volunteers. We build schools all over the world. We have a project in Peru, in Malawi, India, Papua New Guinea, in Puerto Rico, and Rwanda. It is an amazing organization. I was in Papua New Guinea in PNG in May, and we were building a new kindergarten, an early childhood classroom, and it was going to be the first one in the province that had an accessible ramp. That small piece garnered enough attention that the Minister of Education, for the first time, that school's been around for about 15 years, and came to make a speech about how important it is to consider that not everybody is able-bodied and that we ought to make schools accessible and inclusive for all. Wow, what an endorsement for others to think about how they might want to make something as well. And so their prize was a new classroom. This organization, Be the Change, has been building classrooms, teacher housing, and all those types of things. It essentially, or in some ways, is complementary to what you're doing. It's really lifting up the educators and showing a country what can happen when people work together.
I have two more examples from our presentation. We announced our top 3 shortlists. We go from a top 10 to top 3 in 5 categories. There are 15 schools in the world. Today in Sierra Leone, there's a school called the Rising Academy Waterloo that's been shortlisted in our prizes. The Prime Minister went on Twitter, gave a video saying, bring it home. Today in India, there's a public school in one of the largest states of India. The Chief Minister or the Prime Minister of that state, which has 50, 60, 100 million people in it, has gone out and tweeted, or whatever it's called nowadays, Facebook or Instagrammed, about this school. And it's a public school. When you speak to the principals of these schools, what they tell you, the effect of that is just humongous. For example, if I take India as an example, no one really wants to send their kids to any kind of public schools. As a result of celebrating this school and schools like this, there's a queue a mile long outside the school for kids to be enrolled in the school. All of a sudden, teacher status is through the roof, and the perception about teaching has improved. And all of these effects are not insignificant, and they have a long tail to them. And that is what a prize has done. And I'm so proud of everything that my team does and everything our organization does, everything our supporters, our sponsors, our donors have done, that when you think about systems change, I think the next, what is clearly a superpower is your ability to tell a story, because that is the one thing that has moved the needle on things. And we're acquiring those things in this format of a prize, which I think is very powerful.
You're really speaking to the reinforcing loop as well. If you lift up teachers and honor and highlight what they do, will likely influence an individual to want to consider becoming a teacher, which then continues to have this sort of, that's really neat. So if you're just joining us, this is an Imperfect Leader podcast. Our guest is Vikas Pota, the founder of T4 Education. Vikas, in the human-centered leadership model that I speak so much of, and you did speak to this in terms of saying individuals want to know what are some common characteristics. But in the model, there's something called a shared image of success. When I think about the World's Best Schools Prize, there have to be some things that distinguish these schools as one of the best in the world. You've talked a little bit about the cultural field and the importance of leadership. I wonder, are there other pieces that just sort of bubble up as this common characteristic that you might share with others?
I think a feature that really does emanate, and if I think about the way that we would design the prizes, when you think about the World's Best School Prizes, your mind naturally goes to academic achievement, grades, and that kind of thing. Actually, what we're looking at are characteristics and school improvement strategies that we know are evidence in research that actually strengthen schools. For example, we know that schools that are good at community collaboration just do better than everyone else in academic grades and achievement. We know schools that empower young people to take environmental action do better. We know that schools that are innovative, and I don't mean just technologically, just do better. We know that schools that support healthy living do better. We know that schools that know how to overcome adversity and build resilience do better. And so what we find is that the willingness and the acceptance of understanding the hidden curriculum, as I call it, and as educators call it, and these are unfairly, they're called soft connective tissue. There's nothing soft about them. When you look at addressing some of these very knotty challenges that exist in school, actually by thinking about how you help your school build that muscle that it can overcome adversity, or it can prioritize healthy living, or it can be truly innovative in its process, is that commitment to evidence-backed, research-backed strategies that lifts the tide for everyone, including the achievement of great academic results. That is a very common feature we see in all of our schools. The other answer I would give is, I bet any of the schools that actually are successful in our prizes, whilst they compete in one category, I get this sense that they could compete in any of the categories and do well. That's because of the leadership component and the quotient that these schools, generally speaking, do well, because they focus on all this stuff.
How does the term an imperfect leader resonate for you?
I don't know of any other type of leader. Leadership is such a tough subject. I often reflect upon great historical figures, and in one context, they are incredibly great, but in many other contexts, they're flawed. Is that imperfect leadership? Is that flawed leadership? It's a tough subject. I'm no saint. I have made my fair number of mistakes, and I reflect upon those all the time. The other thing I think about is the subject of social entrepreneurship. I thought all entrepreneurship is social. And people talk about that field a lot. Running a business has enormous returns for society. Let's not pretend otherwise. In a similar way, imperfect leadership, I don't know any other type.
And we'll be right back. Hey, district leaders, I know you already know this. In schools worldwide, cell phones are posing real challenges on student engagement and mental well-being, and I want you to meet Yonder, a proud sponsor of An Imperfect Leader. And let me share this story from a visit I made to some schools in Silicon Valley. I asked some kids what they liked about Yonder, and after some funny looks, they shared that actually, with Yonder, teachers don't have to battle with them over phones anymore. In fact, one kid said to me he didn't have to worry anymore about his parents texting him in class, and the kid next to him sort of shoved him and goes, "Texting? My mom used to FaceTime me in class." I want to introduce you to a support system that increases teaching and learning. I want you to discover why 1 million students choose Yonder daily. Minimize distractions, maximize learning potential. To learn more, go to overyonder.com. YONDR. We're back for segment 2 of An Imperfect Leader called Imperfect Leadership in After Action. My guest is Vikas Pota, the founder of T4 Education. As you know, in this segment, we ask our guests to deconstruct a decision that they made, and then we discuss it. Vikas, what happened?
Yeah, so at the end of 2019, I decided to leave a job that I'd loved for a decade. I'd done enough and I wanted new adventures and I wanted new opportunities. What really struck me was this conversation about what should I do next? I perceive it as a successful career and I had a lot of achievement and a lot of really great stuff that happened. At that point, you start thinking about my ego at that point was humongous when I think about it. And my ego told me I was great at so many things. And so I had a plan to go and do something. When I reflect upon that time, as I was starting to make strides, I had a friend of mine in New York, actually, who's a pretty famous guy in what he does. His name is Sri Srinivasan, and I'm sure he'll be thrilled that I speak about it on this podcast. He was at one time the digital guy for the Met Museum in New York, which is a pretty big deal. For some reason, the Met Museum let him go, and he was so distraught because it was a dream job. He put out a post on social media saying, "I'm at a loss as what I should do. And if you have any ideas, here's a Google spreadsheet. Why don't you go and put some ideas?" Thinking a few friends would. Somehow it became very viral, and he had thousands of people go to this sheet. CNN did a news feature. He and I were catching up years after his experience. He was talking to me he was asking me in terms of how I think about things and what I was going to do. And he asked me to pause. He said what he found quite useful through that spreadsheet that was online was a reflective moment where thousands of people had gone in and input what they thought he should do. And he said, look, at this age, when I was in my mid-40s at that time, it's very difficult to reinvent yourself. And so you got to think in terms of, well, what do you do? And what that spreadsheet taught him, he explained to me, was how people perceived him. And he said, if that's how people perceive you, then perhaps you need to think about that a lot more in terms of what you do next. Lo and behold, he asked me to keep a record of conversations over a 3-month period while people called me. And I did so, and I was staggered at the results. I'd done some pretty tough things in my career, and no one asked me about those tough things. And my plans were to pursue that kind of route prior to my conversation with him. What really came through was 90% of the people that called me for 3 things, which have been so intrinsic or so integrated into who I am that I don't think of them as being different. And he said, if that's why people call you, then you should think about whatever you do next, making that the core of everything you do, because that's how people understand you. It's not the full you, but if that's how people understand you, maybe you're better served to think about what you do next in those terms. And I did that. I still remember to this day, everything I've done, those 3 things have been at the core of all my different ventures, all my different activities, all my different service that I do. And I understand what difference I make in a conversation as a result of that exercise. And I thought that was a pretty important decision and reflective moment in my life. I'm glad that friends around me were willing to dispense advice and guide me. People like Sri, he wasn't the only one, but there were others. But that was a pretty important exercise that I went through.
That is a fascinating story. So many educators right now, whether they are teachers who are thinking about becoming principals, who become central office leaders who are considering the work that they've done and the transitions that they are going to make,
often they just follow because they think this is what I should be doing next without first pausing and thinking about what is my moral focus? What are my beliefs, principles, and values, and how might they direct me to do the next thing? I'm really curious, are you willing to publicly say what those three things were?
Yeah, for sure. What was interesting was people called me for three things, right? So one was, and all three are pretty understandable. The first one was I'd done a lot of things around the world and I could provide a perspective. I've stuck my fingers in many pies, I say. And we were in COVID and people were trying to understand what was happening around the world. I understand it's natural to call and say, what are you hearing from Australia? What are you hearing from Brazil? What are you hearing in Seattle where you are? And I was able to articulate that. I understand that's one reason why people called me. The second reason people called me was because of the success I'd had in championing the teacher cause and all the advocacy and promotion of that, and the communications and marketing angles to all this. Earlier in my career, I'd built a marketing and PR agency. I'm not surprised that people used to call me and associate me with that kind of success. People call me for advice on advocacy, especially when it came to education, causes related to it. And the third thing is something that I've never wanted to actually go out there and say that it's been so me for such a long time that firstly, you don't think about it. But the second thing is I consider relationships as being sacrosanct and not something to be traded. But people called me because I know a lot of people. Understanding that brought a lot of clarity in my mind. These three things, if that's what 90% of the calls were about, then whatever I do next has to have that at the core of it, because that's how people want to transact with me, or that's how people want to relate to me. And that's fine. That's not the full me, but it says something when 90% of people call you for it.
I was thinking about this Harvard Business Review article about perception, how you see yourself and how other people see you. It's fascinating as I'm coaching leaders around the country to ask them, how do you see yourself? And then ask them, how do other people see you? I love this new tool that you've given me, so thank you to you and your friend, which is to say, why do people reach out to you? What are the three reasons that you are most likely to be contacted? The third you provided as a convener, as a connector, is such a valuable piece, because I don't see it necessarily as transactional as much as relational, because they respect you and hold you in such high regard. They know that if you're going to refer them to somebody else, it's because you believe in them and you believe that the connection is going to be meaningful for others. So I think that's really special.
It's really interesting. I've always been a little bit, I don't want to use the term shy, but hesitant, because relationships are sacrosanct is the point I make. And I have another friend who's, at one time, the Financial Times wrote about him as being the cleverest man in India. And that says a lot. There's 1 point however many billion people in India. So I laugh about that with him all the time. But I won't mention his name. He knows who he is because he listened to this. But he said, Vikas, there's nothing wrong with knowing a lot of people. Actually, quite a few Nobel Prizes for economics have been given for exactly what you do. I said, what do you mean? And he said, just recently, there was a Nobel Prize for economics that was given to someone who identified that pandemics and crises get worse because of something called coordination failure. And he said that really is testament to your superpower. What it's saying is that you having coffee with lots of people during a day lessens the risk of coordination failure.
I love that. I think it's so true. And it's not just a pandemic, right? You're talking about, if we were to bring us back to highlighting the very best schools across the world, it has to be that they have connection success, in that they are not doing it alone.
Yeah. And so I laughed that he said, I deserve a Nobel, I think he said.
Well, that is fantastic. A Nobel. Way to go.
And so these are some of the things that have been quite interesting and big decision moments in my life in the recent past. And sharing these, I think, will give your listeners perhaps an understanding of how I've gone about doing things, but they may be useful tools for them as well.
So often as part of this after action review process, we ask what happened. And you're going through a transition, very reminiscent of a book I read last summer called From Strength to Strength, thinking about how you build your legacy. There's a point where you're no longer trying to build your brand. You're now transitioning to, what can I offer others? How can I lift them up? How can I be a support? And so I highly recommend that book for those who are thinking about retirement or thinking about a shift in the way they do their work. And so we ask what happened, and then we often ask what got overlooked, or what did you learn about relationships? What frustrated you? I wonder, just with the time that we have remaining, would you pick one of those areas in terms of your own reflection Because it couldn't have just been you were making this transition, you had an intervention from a dear friend, and then everything went well, right? Because there are mid-course corrections throughout our lives. I'm curious, what got overlooked? What did you learn about relationships? What could you have done differently? Talk about that.
Yeah, I also reflect upon that a bit. In my mid-30s, which was some time back, I know it's hard to believe, some 15, 20 years ago, I exited another venture that I started. At that time, I remember the day I'd finished, the day I moved on, I lost 70% of my community and my people around me. It's as if you'd just been dropped all of a sudden. And at that point, I was at a bit of a loss in terms of just my just not the status, but my relevancy, my meaning, my purpose, and all the things that I'd worked hard on. And so when I was leaving my last job, which was just now 4 years ago, I was expecting this similar kind of result, saying this is what the norm is. When you move on, you lose your network and your community. Rather than losing 70% in these last 4 years, I've gained 7,000%. The difference between the two times has been just a process of just applying yourself in a way where you lead with your values, you have integrity at your core, and just do good work that actually stands you in good stead. And people remember, people connect, people want to be associated, people want to connect with you, people want to have a relationship with you. And if you conduct yourself in the right way, people come with you. And I think that's a really important thing that I've learned. And maybe earlier in my career, as much as I'd like to think I did well, I didn't do as well as I could have. But in this stage of my life, I can now reflect and say, the way I would advise other people to think about it, just do great work, carry yourself well, be positive, add value, contribute, have an opinion. All those kinds of things are critical to how people want to relate with you and the connections that you build.
My guest today was Vikas Pota, the founder of T4 Education. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Scott Nearing. He was a writer and an educator in the 1910s, 11, and 12. He traveled around the US. He was sponsored to go find the most promising practices in education across the United States. He wrote a book called The New Education. And really, you are today's Scott Nearing. You are helping the world reclaim the narrative on schools and reminding all of us that when you are a school and a community that promotes resilience and courage and creativity and compassion and innovation, not only will you do wonderful things for your community, you will help change the world to make it a better place. I'm so grateful that you gave me some time today.
I think we should end on this quote. A friend of mine called Maggie McDonnell, who actually won the Global Teacher Prize, used this phrase. And I think it's wonderful. And the phrase is, when education wins, we all win.
Okay, we're back. What do you want to start with? The thing I want to start with is actually the end. And he said this: remember that people want to be associated with people and that they want to connect with you. People want to have a relationship with you. And if you conduct yourself in the right way, people will come with you. He said, I do that as well as I can, but in this stage of life, I can now reflect and say that I would advise other people to think about it and try to do just great work. Carry yourself well, be positive, add value, contribute, have an opinion. All those things are critical to how people want to relate with you and the connections that you build. Why did that resonate for you? Because, sorry to take the pause, he said it differently and more succinctly. Relationships are sacrosanct, not to be transactions. And I truly believe that. One of the reasons why I love this podcast, why I love doing this. So I love why are 3 ways that people might call you or why they might contact you. And the quote that I pulled from that was, and it was really about his friend who said, if that's why people call you, then you should think about whatever you do next, making that the core of everything that you do, because that's how people understand you. And I thought that is really interesting. And then I'm going to share that or stitch that to what you said about have an opinion. I think way too often superintendents think that they can't have an opinion, that they need to find common ground, myself included. And then you find yourself 5 years, 7 years into the job and wondering sometimes, who am I? Or how do people understand me? Because you have shelved your opinions, right? And sometimes your opinions are an expression of your values. And sometimes if you're muting them, then you're constantly running around looking for common ground. And then you find yourself sort of rudderless. What a wonderful reflection. And I fully agree that this has come up before in a previous podcast. Your opinion might get you fired. In this current political environment, your clear opinion. The question is whether or not you're okay with getting fired for that opinion. The trade is, you might lose yourself. I was recently on a podcast called What Are You Made Of? And I posted it just recently. Yeah. Yeah. And they start off with, all right, so what are you made of? I started with this really expressing what my values are, these words. I said, it's not one word. He says, I never said you needed to have one word. I want to know what you're made of. And that was interesting. And it was the first time that I felt comfortable saying my opinion about school safety. He said, well, what do we do about school safety? And I said, you want my real opinion? Get rid of the guns. And he said, huh? I said, look, who needs an AR-15? I said, look, it's been 200 years or more. We're approaching our 250th year as a country. And it's inscribed in the Constitution that there's a right to bear arms. So I recognize there's no way we're moving away from guns. Whereas in New Zealand, there's a shooting in Christchurch, a mass shooting, and the country comes together and says, no more guns. This is ridiculous. We don't need this kind of violence. However, we can start with what someone who has a history of violence should have access to a gun. I said, how much money have schools spent on hardening those schools, bulletproof doors, buzz-in systems, secure vestibules, safety and security guards who are armed, school resource officers, ALICE training so kids know to run or fight or find shelter. So what on earth are we talking about? How much money has been spent on that could be spent on so many better things for children? And before I posted it, I had that, I'm about to put out my opinion, and then I said, well, that's my opinion. I'm going to do it. And maybe it was this conversation with Vikas that sort of compelled me to say, have an opinion. And now I'm going to let you know what it is. I love that. I would say, the link I'll make to Vikas and his best school prize. That's what it's called. Best school. I love even the simplicity of that. But that every category that he said, these are the common traits of what the best schools do. I'll bet you none of them have won for safety against guns. That's right. That's right. Here's what they've won for. Community. I wrote these down because these are gold. They are broad. Yes. But anybody can dig into these. Community collaboration, empowering young people to take environmental action, innovation, not just tech, schools built around healthy living, schools that know how to overcome adversity and build resilience. Yep. And they do that, and I know you do this work with the Equity Collaborative, by establishing or recognizing or highlighting the importance of school culture. He talks about that strong organizational culture. He says, I think the quote, I have it written down, the schools that seem to do well have an incredible leadership team that understands how to embed culture and actually think about that very comprehensively and quite deeply as a means of driving higher performance. And I would imagine if we were to define higher performance, he's talking about like that school in the Philippines that established the mangroves because they understood their place as a place for education and learning. Dude, the school in Colombia, where then the Prime Minister was like, yep, we're going to have to, based on their environmental work, we're going to have new laws for environmental ed and education across the entire country. My jaw was like, yeah. This is what his talk, oh my goodness, when he said people are snooty about prizes, I'm actually really curious. What are your thoughts about prizes? I'm like, oh, that is so me. There's some of it is rooted in how I was raised. This is why your reframe of his prize is quite important and different than a scholarship, as an example, because his prize is a collective prize. It says everyone in this community or school is the best. Oh, you're talking about when I say we're not recognizing that one person, but rather it is the collective that made that place so special. Correct. Yes. Yeah, because I was thinking about how states, particularly in the state where I was, wanted to do a value added, and they were doing value added by particular people as opposed to the school. And I'd say to a legislator, or there was an economist who was guiding the governor's office,
And I'd say, it could be the PE teacher that runs the swim club after school is the reason why kids are coming to school. And it could be the custodian who has breakfast every morning with a child so that that child has a safe place to have breakfast and feel seen. That's what contributes to that amazing reading teacher who's going to do amazing work for that child to learn how to read and to excel. So you have to reward and recognize the entire school.
100%.
And I am super snooty about prizes. I don't have any interest in them. I'm not searching them out. I've already said this before. I was raised in a family who believed that your last name is more important than your first name. We over I, all the time, constantly. So much so that when I went to Stanford University and got my graduate degree, which was a huge honor to go to the same university that my grandfather went to, etc., massive. My degree hangs in my mother's house because she went to Stanford University. She goes to alumni events. Like, she'd never attended Stanford University, but she goes to Stanford University alumni events because, well, my son went. And as a result, he went because I helped him to go. I made it possible for him to go. I am not particularly interested in the Grammys and the Oscars. This changed my entire view on him. I was like, he's right. Because the school being recognized causes a ripple effect with other people naming it. It creates a pride. When he talked about that school in India, increasing the positive teacher perception of all the teachers that work there, like, wow, they're great, by recognizing one school. Do you imagine what that does to lifting every teacher? Not only the really strong ones, but the not so strong ones. Okay, Jamie, you get the final word. He opened with, there are great schools everywhere. Why aren't there more? That question should be asked over and over and over and over and over and over and over. You can make it a fractal. There are great teachers everywhere. Why aren't there more? There are great superintendents everywhere. Why aren't there more?
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really good. Yeah, you're right. I sense that we're going to go visit some of these schools.
So here we go. We're going to see each other again next week. I'm Peter Stiepelman.
And I'm Jamie Manzan.
And you've been listening to An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast.
All right, see you next week.
Music for An Imperfect Leader was written and arranged by Ian Varley. Sam Falbo created our artwork, a wood print inspired Daruma doll butterfly. Remember, imperfect leadership is not a scarlet letter. It's a badge of honor. It recognizes that serving as a lead learner is about being a vulnerable leader, an empathetic leader, a compassionate leader. We are proud to be imperfect leaders, so join us next time for another episode of An Imperfect Leader, the Superintendents and Leadership Podcast. At the end of every interview that we have for teacher candidates, we will say, what questions do you have for us? And they will always ask, well, what kind of support can I expect? And we will always say, well, don't worry, we'll give you a mentor. But it's not real mentorship. I mean, it's support with the difficult kid or the field trip form or the grade card, but it isn't coaching. That's where partners like EdConnective step in. They provide observation and feedback with practice. That's real coaching. Their mission is to ensure that every student thrives by facilitating exceptional educator growth. So whether it's science of reading, whether it's leadership development, whether you're trying to build the best recruitment and retention efforts, check out edconnective.com.